Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there, very good evening. Welcome to another edition of Newsline Live. We know that in Sri Lanka we are facing a governance crisis. In addition, of course, to the economic crisis and, of course, the socio-economic crisis, the peak of which we experienced last year. Good governance seems to be evading us at every turn. We gave it a shot back in 2015, but look at where we are today, just 8 years down the line. Looking into the future, where will Sri Lanka be? Is good governance just a dream for all Sri Lankans? Can it ever be achieved? To discuss these matters and more, we've got with us today Professor Arjuna Parakrama to give us a little bit of insight onto this and, of course, the more broader aspect of governance here in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, Professor, for accepting our invitation and joining us on this show. First things first, Professor. Now, we all know that elections are a vital component of a functioning democracy. Sri Lanka, at least from an economic standpoint, a lot of economists knew that Sri Lanka was going down a very vicious path, that we were going into this economic cycle, this vicious debt trap that we were going to. People knew about it, but nobody really spoke about it. Nobody came out and sounded any alarm bells. Not even the big corporates who were very, very well aware of what was happening in Sri Lanka, especially since the massive tax cuts back in 2019. They ignored it, the people ignored it, and at the end of the day, everybody suffered the consequences. Besides the economic crisis, what we're facing right now is also a governance crisis. There are a lot of people who understand this governance crisis. They know it exists. They know that elections are being postponed arbitrarily. No one is talking about it because, of course, those in the highest echelons of government are the ones who are perpetrating this or postponing elections. So nobody's talking about this again. Do you think that the governance crisis in Sri Lanka will also turn out or pan out the same way the economic crisis did? Once we have passed the point of no return, everything comes crashing down, and then it's all, how can we, fix this again?
Okay. Thank you. I think that's a pretty big set of questions. I'd like to take it at the beginning. I think just the same way that the economic crisis has been oversimplified into a foreign debt crisis, so that you're forgetting the root causes and you're thinking of a consequence as the cause. So everybody is trying to address the debt crisis and not recognizing that the debt crisis is a direct product of economic policies and economic plans which were wrong or at least not effective. Similarly, I think even the political crisis, if one tends to sort of equate it only to elections, and I think one is missing a bigger picture here, because actually what do we have on the ballot? We have generally people from the same families who are related to each other and various kinds of things. So it's the
people whose party allegiances are not very clear, quite muddled, I'd say,
yes,
at this
and
point.
In fact, members of the same family are on 2 or 3 sides. It's a matter of insurance, I think. So I think we have to look at the broader kinds of issues about governance itself. Let me first mark also, remember that governance is a term that came in the 1990s, sponsored by people like the World Bank and so on. Actually, the word hides this notion of power, authority, so let's talk about it the way it is. It's about power, right? The wielding of power, the exercise of authority undemocratically and so on. When you say governance, we kind of tend to whitewash it into something. So we have a crisis of legitimacy. And that crisis of legitimacy, as you quite rightly pointed out, is related to, at the very minimum, not having elections at the right time. And I think I'm more sanguine than you are. I think that we will definitely have elections next year. We have to, not because anybody wants it particularly, but I think it would be impossible to function without that. We have both a parliament and an executive that's not legitimate in the way that we understand it. But of course, we then have a broader issue. But how do we try to make the voting, the process, something beyond a question of, I want this to be done in my home, I want something else to be done, I want a job to be got, I want certain other kinds of things, which is what we tend to vote for. And I think we have to look at creating the minimum standards which everybody has to adhere to. And
But Professor, then when you speak about creating minimum standards, who creates these minimum standards? Because a voter, a constituent, only gets to vote once in 5 years. And most of these people, even the many new faces that came into parliament, of course, through movements like the Vietmaga, where they hailed and themselves as professionals, with proper ethics and standards. Even these people, once they do get into parliament, they end up being in that same rut, that political cesspool of power-hungry individuals. They join the pack.
Yeah, that I think is different. I think we need to recognize that there is a political class. I have been writing and saying that there is also a class which is parliament, which acts in its own interest, whether they oppose or propose.
So when you say setting standards, who sets the standards?
Yeah, I think it's up to civil society, and I think that the Aragale has taught us, if at all, that we no longer have a passive citizenry that votes every 5 years or 6 years or 4 years and keeps quiet. I think that demonstrated, both in its strength and its failure, it demonstrated that the citizens no longer are happy with representational democracy of that kind, where you hand over everything. They want to stand up and be counted. And I think that's why elections were postponed, because they realize it's not going to be as much the same old as it were earlier. So I think, for example, this is the IMF agreement is a good opportunity for civil society, for other interested groups to say these are the benchmarks. Let us take a few concrete steps. For example, the asset declaration issue. I think we need that to be entrenched properly. We need legislation to be brought in which makes it transparent and accountable, and it should be proactive so people can access.
So Professor, do you think it's unfair to ask the people who we vote for, the people who we entrust governance, and then, like you quite rightly pointed out, power and authority over us, the people who we willingly give this power and authority to be completely transparent and be, look here I am, this is me, this is what I own, and this is what, these are my assets and liabilities. Is it unfair to us?
Not at all. In fact, it comes with the territory, and it is a standard that's maintained in most democracies.
But I remember quite distinctly several politicians coming on this show, and whenever I pose them this question, have you declared your assets and liabilities? Don't you think it's time to do that? There were quite varied responses. Some said that it is unfair to expect politicians to reveal their assets and declarations. Some said that it's against their own financial and business interest to reveal these assets and declarations. And some politicians even went so far to say that if I tell my constituents that I have this much of money, this many assets, they will start coming and asking me for money, for help. There were those who went that far. So how do you respond to that?
I think the legislation is quite sophisticated. So there are certain personal spaces which are redacted. So it's not that you have everything that is publicly available. What is important is there. And after all, you choose to be a politician. You choose to be a politician to serve the people. You can't suddenly say they're asking me for favors. Therefore, then why are you in politics? Are you in politics for what you can get? So I think there are self-seeking arguments. The basic problem is we need to address corruption. We need to address corruption in all of its forms. Not only must it be addressed, it must be seen to be addressed. So if the population sees visibly politicians getting richer and more affluent by the day, then I think they have a right to find out what is there. You choose to be in the public limelight. So for example, the privacy that you will enjoy as a private citizen is not the same as the privacy that you will, the limits and constraints that you will enjoy if you're a public figure.
Okay, Professor, let's delve into that argument. You said that corruption or doing away with corruption must be seen as well, or these corrupt activities or perceived corrupt activities must be seen. And your argument is that many of these corrupt activities are not seen, of course, because of the lack of laws to mandate asset declarations.
And those that are there are not implemented.
Yes, and those that are there are not implemented. But let's take a very pertinent example, a timely example. Parliamentarian Ali Sabri Rahim. He smuggled in gold from Dubai via the VIP entrance into the BIA airport. that is reserved, of course, for VIPs, and him in his capacity as a parliamentarian was a VIP. So let's not mince words here and agree that he smuggled the gold in from Dubai. The gold was seized and he was fined. But then where is the consequence? I mean, technically, by the book, he is a gold smuggler who is now in Parliament.
Well, I don't want to talk about the particular case because I don't know, but the principle is very clear. Parliament has tended to be a refuge for all kinds of people who cannot make it in any other place in the country, you know. There is no minimum qualification, there is nothing. So I think that part is clear, but the only way to do that is by reform that makes these things transparent and accountable, that parliamentarians need to be accountable. People need to be able to ask them. For example, we need reform which, as you say, you know, requires them to measure up to a standard which the public demand. Now, when that happens, and if you say, oh, that's too much invasion of my privacy and so on, then my response is, then don't seek election. You're not forcing people to seek election. There are plenty of people who will be willing to do it even with these constraints. So I think we have to, the audience tables, we have to clean the audience tables. There is no question about it. And in order to do that, we have to have legislation that's implemented. Now, as you know, the asset declaration law is completely meaningless. You know, you have to file RTI in order to get the information, then you can't make it public. So I think there are things like that that need to be done. So one step, I think, would be to make sure that all existing legislation is implemented, right, without fear or favor. The next would be to look at policy changes that are required and also structural changes that are required, and both categories are necessary. But unless we pursue a very proactive and absolutely zero tolerance option, I think it's not going to happen. And I think, I mean, I may be unduly optimistic here, but I think that in the coming election, whenever it is held, that those who are sort of well known to be either corrupt or to indulge in illegal activities will be booted out. That is, I think, the one deterrent that you have.
But Professor, let's speak a little bit about this party political system. People have lost faith in almost all parties. There were several surveys conducted by several notable organizations which showed that no party has a clear majority. The actual popularity of many of these party leaders were quite literally below zero. So given the fact that Sri Lanka's democracy is based on multi-party politics, how do you think the governance system will adjust itself, or the people would adjust themselves in the coming election?
Well, I actually believe that a strong opposition and with no party having sort of more than 50% is a good thing, because then we are back to the early systems where you have to negotiate, you have to compromise, you have to discuss, you have to come together. You can't bamboozle the rest of the house with just some stupid legislation just because the party, you know, says so. So I think we have to go back to that, where you have to discuss, people have to come to the table, it has to be public discussion, it has to be open. Now what happens is, whatever discussion is there, we know that there is the majority to rubber stamp whatever it is that comes. So that makes actually parliamentary discussion a joke. It makes the whole business a travesty. So I think a strong opposition and the fact that no single party will have a clear majority is a good thing. In fact, if you remember, until at one stage, the governments in power always needed the so-called minority party vote in order to achieve majority. As a result, there was not much of this
ethnic conflicts.
Yes, and majoritarian stuff at a minimum, maybe for the wrong reason. But that's what happened. When you have one group that has an absolute majority, like there is now, and then of course there is no justification, because Parliament is not accountable to anybody. That's a sad situation.
Well, Professor, much more needs to be spoken of this. We will return after this short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Newsline live.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Indian Minister of Defence to visit Sri Lanka next week. Plans to look into fuel pipelines in Trincomalee. President reveals details on how Trincomalee will be developed. under the agreement with India.
වෙරුගල්ලාරු සිට පානම කුමන දක්වා මූදු කරේ දියුණු කරන්නටත් වැඩසටහනක් සකස් කරගෙන.
Chinese research vessel ready to travel to Sri Lanka to enter the sea of Sri Lanka during the last week of October. Final decision on how Social Security Fund will be used in domestic debt restructuring to be reached on the 28th. A joint series of objections to protect the Social Security Fund. Only 2 out of the 14 countries that underwent domestic debt restructuring during the past 25 years used the Social Security Fund, says Verity Research. 3 shootings by motorbike killers during the last 24 hours. Former head of the CID, Shania Besekara, released from charges of falsifying evidence against former DIG Bas. Parliamentarian Ali Sabri Rahim, who smuggled gold from Dubai, brought before the Ethics and Privileges Committee.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline Live. We're in discussion with Professor Arjuna Parakrama. Professor, we were speaking about governance in Sri Lanka.
Please call me Arjuna. Huh?
Okay, Professor. We were speaking about the governance issues in Sri Lanka, of course, and what we can expect in the future, especially with people losing hope in party politics. Professor, you said you were optimistic about an election being held last year, but I think you would have been around, of course, when elections were illegally postponed in Sri Lanka back in the 70s, I believe, and a referendum was held, the legitimacy of which hasn't quite been decided by Parliament. But of course, anyone who knows history would know how things panned out back in the day. And the fact that you initially said that it's always, families and the elite serving their own purposes, and a member of the same family also steering the top of the governance structure here in Sri Lanka, being there in that position at this point of time. Don't you have even a little bit of fear that the mistakes of the past will be repeated again?
Oh, I think they will continue to be repeated. But I think the mere fact of an election, particularly post-Aragale, where there is some fear that it won't be the same as usual, I think that is a deterrent. So that's very important. If you notice the way Parliament behaved during the period that there was going to be local government elections, and immediately after, we should also tell you that sadly, that's the only deterrent that's there. That they're only accountable once in so many years to going to the polls, because there, Parliament acting as a social class is kind of broken a little bit, because then they have to fight against,
show that they are the people's, they are for the people.
And they have to fight against each other. So I'm not saying that the process is perfect, but that's one check and balance. And I think therefore it's incumbent on civil society groups, when there is an election, to ensure that these minimum standards are met. For example, I think society groups need to say, do not vote for people who are corrupt, and these are the kinds of
corrupt people,
and these are the lists of corruption. Do not vote for these sorts of things. Also, I think it's important for us to go beyond only the negative corruption stuff, but also this governance issues. For example, what about devolution and the 13th Amendment? What about demilitarization? What about issues that relate to the plantation and their rights? I think we have to build those in. And those can be best done in an election period.
But whenever it comes to an election period, the discussions on these very issues that you spoke of, delimitation, demilitarization, then the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, all of these issues are just brought back down into the old strife that communities had between each other. And ethnic conflicts are created, manufactured even, to suit the needs of certain politicians, and they ride on that wave of popularity and then enter Parliament, and that's the end of it. And the worst that could happen is obviously people, the general public, losing their lives, losing their livelihoods, and going through so much of pain in a country that has already suffered so much due to these unwanted, created, manufactured ethnic conflicts.
Let me strike a slightly different note. If you study the Aragale carefully, you would see towards the end, The Argelia itself developed a kind of much better diversity platform where people could actually talk about the war in the north and the east, they could talk about issues of alternate sexualities, they could talk about disappearances and so on. So I think we are not going exactly back to the other stuff. I agree with you that these particular issues will be used in very narrow and sort of completely objectionable ways. But I think we have come a bit of age now, and I think those who do that will then lose the votes of those who think that that's no longer possible or no longer right. For example,
But then how many votes do you think that is, Professor?
Well, certainly, I mean, I think clearly the minority, the small parties, the small parties who have been towing a nationalist line, you mark my words, during the election they will tone that down a bit. And I don't know whether it'll be strategic or hypocritical or whatever it is, but I think it's no longer possible to be as overtly racist as people were 5 years ago, right? And I think the reason for that is that many have understood the issue of class. I believe that conflicts and crises are also productive. I think the economic crisis, not the debt crisis, the economic crisis and the political crisis have united in some sense groups of people who suffer equally, whether they're Sinhala or Tamil or Muslim or urban or rural. And I think they've realized that the enemy is not necessarily somebody who has a different religion or speaks a different language or shares a different culture, but the enemy is then this sort of this economic setup which creates the kind of inequalities and exploitation. Let's face it, we have business that wants to be mollycoddled. There is no risk taking and then therefore rewards for the risk. They want to be mollycoddled, and they want huge benefits and safety nets for them, not for the poor. And you have a situation now, unfortunately, where the costs of reform are meted out against the poor and the benefits are for business. So that's a terrible situation.
I think the best example, of course, is the use of the Employees Provident Fund and the Employees Trust Fund and other supranational funds for the domestic debt restructuring. And I think it was Verite research that said during the last 25 years, only 2 countries have done this, and one was Ghana. And the other country, I can't quite remember because it's such a small country. And even Ghana always tried not to restructure their social security fund. Every other country restructured the private creditors and the banking sector. And this comes against a backdrop where the money of these people that they've been saving, working for 20, 30, 40 years of their life, the value of that money had reduced drastically due to inflation.
Yes, and it also makes it worse because the central bank is, on the one hand, the custodian of those superannuation funds, and it's also the entity that decides those funds should be, and when they say, for example, that you're going to cap interest of the provident funds at 9%, how many people know that the central bank's own superannuation fund is at 19%? So they're not even, distributing everything with the same spoon. There's a different spoon for them. So, do you understand what I mean? So the general superannuation funds of all private and public employees are at 9%. Their own fund is much higher than that.
So the employees at the central bank would be getting bigger, better, higher benefits despite the domestic debt restructuring at the tune of 10%.
Something like that, yes, yeah, more. Yeah, so and you can see that's a conflict of interest, isn't it? It's a clear conflict of interest. So those are the kinds of things I think that we need greater transparency and accountability, and I think an election will lay that bare. So we clearly have to work on existing regulations being more transparent, more accountable, even for example human rights stuff. We don't know what cases are available, what are on hold, corruption cases. So we need that to be public and proactive. We have a completely opaque, a completely sort of non-public setup. Take, for example, the Attorney General's Department. I think it's very important that the Attorney General's Department at least is sort of either divided or something where there is a public prosecutor's office and that they do prosecution of corruption. Now they appear to be in the form of defending the regime. Therefore, they do.
Again, there is also a conflict of interest there. But that's, of course, a topic for another day, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us on our show and clarifying these matters. Of course, I think what is most evident from our conversation today is that the people need to bring about the change, and the best time and the best place to bring about this change is at an election. And as usual, Professor, like we discussed, I think there will be attempts to make people emotive, make people think through their heart instead of their brain. But it's up again to the people to say, this time we are going to do things differently. Thank you very much for tuning in. Take care and God bless.
Thank you.